Hi there, second graders, and welcome back to another day of listening and learning with Miss Catrone. As you know, we are studying in Domain 9, which is all about the American Civil War. Today we are on lesson 11, and the title of our lesson is The End of the Civil War. So as we're listening today, I want you guys to listen to find out what side won the war. Was it the northern states or the Union, or was it the southern states, the Confederacy? Yesterday, we found out that the northern states had more soldiers and more equipment. So my prediction is that the North is going to win. But yesterday, you made predictions about what side you think is going to win. Let's find out now. All right, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to get right to reading. All righty, here we have people reading newspapers. In 1865, news stories did not travel as quickly as they do today. There were no televisions, no telephones, or even radios. There were newspapers, but the news stories could be about things that happened days or even weeks before. There were also telegraphs, which were short typed messages that required special skills to read. They're almost like in code. It could take several days for news to reach soldiers who were miles away from a town or city with a telegraph wire. It could also take days or even weeks for news to reach their families. In tiny towns all over America, parents, wives, and children of soldiers were waiting for a son, a husband, or a father to return home from the war. So on April 9th, 1865, it took a little while for news to spread that in a small farmhouse in the village of Appomattox? Appomattox. I have to stretch that one out. That's a word I've never seen before. But I use the strategy, stretchy snake, to stretch out the word, and I also use chunky monkey to kind of chunk it up into smaller words that I knew how to read. Of the courthouse in Virginia, Robert E. Lee offered his sword to Ulysses S. Grant and surrendered the remainder of his Confederate army. Within days, most other Confederate armies that had been fighting in other parts of the country surrendered as well. The rebel soldiers laid down their weapons, made oaths to give up the rebellion and never fight against the United States again, and walked home. What are oaths? Oaths are like a promise. So they made a promise to never rebel again. And then what side were the rebel soldiers on? They were on the Confederate side. So they made a promise never to fight against the Union again, and they also surrendered their weapons, and they made those promises or oaths. The Union soldiers were relieved. At last, the long Civil War was ended, and the North had won. What was the North called during the Civil War? Yeah, it was called the Union. Good job. The Union soldiers, it was time to return home to rest and rebuild the nation. It had taken 4 long years, but the United States was on its way to being united again. United means together as one. So were your predictions correct about who would win this in the end? Did you guys say the Union or the North? I did, so I hope you did too, because it would make sense since they had more soldiers and more weapons. For the most part, cities of the North had not been damaged. Why was the North hardly damaged? Do you know? Well, a lot of the battles happened in the South, so that's where their plantations were destroyed. With the end of the war, Northerners started to think about how to make the country bigger. They focused on building more railroads and spreading westward across the Mississippi River through Missouri and Kansas, over the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to California. Why did people want to spread out west? I know that if you were in 2A, we talked a lot about the westward expansion, and you know that they had more land that they could build new houses on, and you also know that some people were moved out west and it was not their choice, like the Native American tribes that were, forced to move out west. For people in the North, life would finally start getting back to normal. They were glad to have something to make in their factories other than weapons and uniforms for wars. Things are starting to get back to normal. Here we are in Richmond, Virginia. Oh no, it looks like this town has been destroyed. Let's find out. Most of the battles had been fought in the South. Southerners were relieved that the war was over as well. Even if the Confederacy had lost the war, at least there was no more fighting. Nearly all the towns and cities were now ruined and burned, smashed by cannonballs and ransacked or searched through by armies in search of food. Farmlands, roads, railroad tracks, and bridges had been destroyed as well. Times were harder by far in the South after the war. The US government sent money and supplies, as well as soldiers, to keep order and start rebuilding towns and cities. This was called Reconstruction because they were rebuilding or reconstructing the South. But it would take many years before there would be true peace, prosperity, and equality in the South. Prosperity is wealth or good fortune, and equality is fairness. For millions of enslaved African Americans in the South, all of this destruction not only meant the end of the war, it meant freedom from life of slavery. The enslaved Africans were now free people. They could not be forced to work on plantations anymore. They could not be sent away from their families anymore. They were free from slavery and ready to start their lives over again. How do you think these slaves felt about being free? I think they were probably really relieved and happy. We're not done with that picture, my bad. Remember earlier you heard that it took some time for news to travel? Well, it took 2 months for the news that the war had ended to reach African Americans in the state of Texas. So even though they had been technically free for 2 months, the news had not reached them yet in Texas. It's wild. The Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, to announce the end of the war and the abolishment of slavery. Abolishment is the end of slavery. When the African American people in Galveston heard the news, they immediately began to celebrate with prayer, feasting, music, and dancing. Today, Juneteenth is a holiday tradition celebrated annually on June 19th in many states across the country. It is the oldest known celebration recognizing the end of slavery. All right, here we have a northern city. Many African Americans freed from slavery wanted to get as far away from the South as possible. Why do you think they would want to get away from the South? Yeah, because that's where they were held as slaves and that's where they had to work on those plantations for no money. And maybe they wanted to get just as far away from that as they could. Some moved north to cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Washington, D.C. Many arrived with no possessions, that means things, or money, nothing but the clothing on their back and hope for a better life. They worked in factories, they built new businesses, and created new neighborhoods, schools, and communities. However, African Americans still faced some of the toughest challenges of all. For although they were free, they did not have the same rights as white Americans in the North or the South. The end of the Civil War was the beginning of a new age in America. There were still hard times ahead, as well as sadness, but the country was unified as a single nation. Right here we have a monument. You heard that word before. This is the Lincoln Memorial. It's in Washington, D.C. The Civil War produced many heroes, including one of the most famous Americans of all, Abraham Lincoln. His face appears today on U.S. money, including the penny and the $5 bill. There are thousands of towns, buildings, roads, bridges, tunnels, such as the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, and people named after him. In Washington, D.C., there is a giant monument honoring him called the Lincoln Memorial. A monument is a structure built in memory of someone or something. Have you guys ever seen the Lincoln Memorial, even just in a picture? 100 years after the Civil War, an African American named Dr. Martin Luther King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and gave the famous I Have a Dream speech. 100 years after the end of slavery, Dr. King and other African Americans continued to work and struggle for fair treatment and equal rights. So this location right here is actually right where Dr. King stood when he gave that famous speech that we know at the I Have a Dream speech. He stood right here in Washington, D.C. and gave his speech. That's a very cool monument. All right, here we have Harriet Tubman. Throughout the Civil War, Harriet Tubman continued risking her life to free slaves and end slavery. During some battles, she also worked as a nurse and sometimes as a spy for the Union Army. Because Harriet Tubman knew the roads and the secret trails all around Maryland, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, she was able to spy on the Confederate Army, telling Union generals which direction the army was going and how many men they had. That's kind of cool that she also was a spy. After the war, Harriet Tubman moved to Washington, D.C., where she helped the thousands of newly slaved African Americans find jobs and homes and begin their new lives. She also worked for women's rights. During the time of the Civil War, women, Black and white alike, were not allowed to vote. Can women vote today? Yeah, we're going to hear later about that in a different domain. That was one of the many important changes America still had to make in order for all citizens to truly be free. All right, here we have Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was a hero throughout the North. He went on to become President of the United States in 1869. So after he was the general, he became president. That's cool. His old rival, Robert E. Lee, moved back to his farm in Virginia, but he was never the same again. A rival is someone who you compete against. He died 5 years later, sad and regretful, haunted by all the things he could have or should have done differently during the war, but was still proud to have fought for Virginia. So he was really sad after he got out of the war. In many parts of America, people were eager to move on into the future. The war had brought about a few positive changes besides freeing the African Americans and keeping the country together. The North had developed new railroad lines to help deliver war supplies. Companies were eager to expand those railroads, especially in the West. Within a few years, there were new railroads crisscrossing the country from New York to California and back again. Telegraph wires had expanded as well, so it became possible for a person in New York and a person in California to communicate, share news, and conduct business without waiting weeks for a letter to be delivered by train or on horseback. Do you remember when mail was traveled on horseback, we called it the Pony Express? We learned about that in the Westward Expansion Unit. Alrighty. In the northern factories and schools, the Civil War had encouraged a new generation of inventors and scientists. An inventor creates or invents new things. Now that the war was over, those inventors could think about new ways to help people, instead of thinking of ways to win the war. They invented new trains, new telegraphs, new machines of all sorts. Doctors had discovered new types of medicine and new ways to treat injuries and diseases. The Civil War changed the United States in many ways. Hundreds of thousands of men were dead, millions were wounded and badly injured. At the same time, the nation was once again one nation, and millions of former enslaved African Americans were now free. Many fought for this freedom, including many African Americans. Now all Americans were working toward a better, brighter future. All right, guys, that's the end of our story. So this next part, I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to go over them with you. Don't feel like you need to write these down now, because at the end, you're going to fill out a quiz. Once you do the quiz, that's how I'll give you credit for today's lesson. All right, number 1, who won the war? The Union side won the war. Who surrendered to whom? Remember, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant by giving him his sword. How long did the Civil War last? It lasted 4 years. What did the end of the war mean? It means that the country was united again and that slavery was ended. Who had a bigger challenge after the war, the North or the South? What did we say had a bigger challenge? The South did. Why did they have a harder time? Because most of the battles were fought in the South, and therefore their land was destroyed. What kind of changes took place after the war ended? Remember, we learned about that there was new inventions, that there were better railroads, there were better ways to communicate, and it could be faster. Many African Americans moved north, and new machines and doctors created new things, new ways to treat diseases. What did Harriet Tubman do after the war? Well, she helped the newly freed African Americans find homes and jobs. She worked for women's rights. What did Ulysses S. Grant do after the war? He became president. Good job. Alrighty, guys, like I said, all of those questions are going to be in a quiz after. All right, here is our word work for today, our vocabulary for today. The word is united. My turn, united. Your turn. Good job. In the read aloud, you heard this sentence. It had taken 4 long years, but the United States was on its way to be united again. If something is united, it is not divided, but together as one. So right now my hands are united because they're together as one. Have you ever seen a group of people working together? Try to use the word united when you think about it. I know that all of the teachers have united to make cool lesson plans for you guys while you're home. So we've all worked together as one. As part of the quiz, I'm going to have you write a sentence where you use the word united. Alrighty, guys, so we have been talking about antonyms, and antonyms are the opposite. So the opposite or antonym of the word united is divided. So if you're not united as one, you're divided as 2 or more parts. So I'm gonna read you some sentences and you're gonna decide if it's united or divided. A room full of people fighting. Are they united as one or divided? They're divided if they're fighting against each other. All of the states in the United States today, all of the states in the United States, are we chunked up into different parts of the Union and the Confederacy? No, not anymore. We are all united. Number 3, students arguing about how to decorate the cafeteria for a party. Students arguing about how to decorate the cafeteria for a party. Yeah, they're divided because they can't agree. Number 4, parents discussing how they can help raise money for the school. Parents discussing how they can raise money for the school. They're united. They all have one goal, to raise money for the school. Last one, basketball teammates passing the ball to each other and scoring a basket. Yeah, they're united as one team. Alrighty, guys, that is the end of our lesson today. So like I said, after this video, you're going to complete the quiz, and that's how I'll give you credit for today. I have loved teaching you guys all about the American Civil War, and that was our last lesson in that domain, but that just means we get to practice with some Kahoots, take a little exam or a little test, and then we'll start a new unit. But I've loved teaching you about the American Civil War. As always, you're gonna dojo me or email me if you have any questions about this, and I'll get right back to you. Alrighty, guys, talk to you soon. Bye.